Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Dr. Rohinton Medhora on the subject of Canada-Africa Relations. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. I'm Dr. Andrew Thompson, Adjunct Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and Program Officer at the Balsey School of International Affairs. I'm very happy to be this week's guest host. Joining me today is Dr. Rohinton Medhora, the President of the Center for International Governance Innovation, who is a specialist in the areas of international development, monetary policy, and international trade. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Medhora is here with us today to talk about a new volume of essays in the Canada Among Nations series. This is the 27th edition. It's a book that he has co-edited, and the title is Canada-Africa Relations, Looking Back, Looking Ahead. It is published by CIGI in partnership with the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University with the support of the International Development Research Center based in Ottawa. Thank you for joining us. I was struck in the first paragraph when you wrote that this book is both untimely and timely. What did you mean by that?
So first, Andrew, thank you for having me. What we meant by that is precisely that Africa has not figured in Canadian foreign policy in any significant and meaningful way. This series, which is of long standing, as you know, has never treated Africa in any diligent fashion, so that in that sense it is timely. It is untimely in the sense, but one could also turn that argument on its head and say, well, there's a reason for this sort of dynamic, and if it's the case, why would the subject merit this kind of attention? Our own sense is that the dynamics around Canadian foreign policy are changing, and that Africa, as I hope we make the point in the book, is changing significantly. And so now is a very good time, almost an inflection point in Canada-Africa relations. And so it's on balance a very timely moment to examine the issue in all its dimensions. And so that's my final point, that this is not about an aid relationship. This is truly about a partnership between two regions.
And perhaps just building on that, one of the central themes in the book is this notion of Africa rising. And what do you and your contributors mean by that idea, both in terms of opportunities ahead, but also some of the challenges that come with this idea of Africa rising?
Right. So Africa rising has been a moniker that's been used for about 10 years now, both in the popular press, but also in the scholarly literature. And it has to do with the fact that there's a series of economic, political, and social developments in Africa which are quite different and promising compared to the post-independence history with which Africa, unfortunately, has come to be associated. Economic. Africa has had consistently higher than 5% growth for over a decade now. We, I think, as a global community, are correctly impressed by what's going on in Asia and parts of Latin America. But we forget that the most consistent and, in fact, well-distributed growth has been in Africa. Politically, the landscape has changed quite significantly. There are more democracies now, there are more semi-democracies now, there's less conflict than there has been in several decades. And that in itself leads to a virtuous cycle of social and economic developments, which one cannot really, in any sense, ignore. And a symbol of all of that is the fact that not only have raw materials prices been buoyant, about which, frankly, Africa can do very little on its own, but, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, in our discussion, the spin-offs of that whole dynamic have been good and bad, but in our estimation, on balance, good. And so you have a sense where Africa, as a region, possesses something, raw materials, that the rest of the world desires. It now has a better educated population and ruling elite than it has ever had before. And it is part of the global system, including the emergence of powers within it, like Nigeria and South Africa, as it has never been before. So Africa is now an important part of that global equation, which we never saw it as in the past.
Wonderful. Now, in your introduction, you also qualify this, though, that despite all of the wonderful progress that has been made, there are still some obstacles to overcome. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Teddy Sammy, my co-editor, and I spent a lot of time thinking that one through and reading that one through. And the fact is, you don't simply get rid of historic legacies in a decade or two. So we understand that the deepest rooted poverty, in some senses, the number of landlocked countries, all of those very structural issues remain in Africa. There are some conflicts of long standing, both in Eastern and in Southern Africa or Central Africa, which in sometimes are almost connected and don't seem to be going away. Somalia, as a failed state, still has the potential to disrupt progress elsewhere, as it every now and then does. But broader than that, I'd say the biggest root of pessimism has to do with how African countries have used the buoyancy of mineral prices that we were talking about. To be sure, some of them have grown and created structures that will endure. But there's a sense that African countries have not diversified their economic structures enough away from mineral processing. And that really is the biggest risk the continent faces economically and indeed politically going ahead.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Medhora. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. I thought we might continue our discussion of this idea of Africa rising and focus the discussion on governance in Africa. There is a perception, a long-standing perception, that governance has been very weak in Africa, and yet some of the evidence that you point to in the book suggests that in the last decade things have improved and quite significantly. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on this new trend and perhaps offer some insights into why this has happened.
Indeed. I think it's fair to say that no one knows yet exactly where governance on the continent is headed, but that the weight of the evidence suggests that it is an optimistic outlook. And so first thought might be, what do we mean by governance? By governance, I'm simply assuming the quality of government and the quality of interaction between governments and their peoples and between states and markets. So it's that range of relationships that keeps a country whole and keeps it happy and prosperous. As we were discussing previously, I think what's been at the root of the improved governance is a number of things, many of which were painful at the time they first played out. I have no doubt that the IFIs, the World Bank, the African Bank, and the other donors that have worked in Africa have a controversial association with the continent. But on balance, one of the legacies that we cannot simply dispute is that the balance between states and markets, understanding the limits of markets and understanding the limits of states and their capabilities to regulate markets, is a much more sophisticated understanding today than it was at the start of the structure adjustment era in the early and mid 1970s. There has been a generation of flow, both into the continent and away from it, of technocrats, of officials, of students, and all of that, which makes for a governing elite, and it still is an elite, which I'd say is much more sophisticated now and capable of understanding problems and dealing with them than historically has been the case. I think the decimation of the social sector, and particularly of the education sector in the continent during the crude years of structural adjustment, is behind us. Investments in that area have been buoyant. And there are some important programs, and Canada should be proud of having been central to them. I'll come to that in a second, which have actually built a generation of capability to deal with the environmental, scientific, political challenges the continent faces. So if I come back to the economics community, something called the African Economic Research Consortium, which in fact the Rockefeller Foundation and Canada's IDRC, my former employer, I should say, started some decades ago, has been at the root of a renaissance in higher education and understanding of economic policy and economic education. The same kinds of examples can be cited in Francophone Africa, can be cited on the environment and climate change front, and in African universities more generally. So I think there has been a good mix of external players and local capacity that's come together. That has created, as I say, a sense of space. At the same time, as we all know, the end of the Cold War led to a series of dynamics in which it was not simply enough to be a client of one great power or the other. And so I think it's safe to say that the rest of the world has backed democracy in ways that it simply wouldn't or couldn't in the years of the Cold War. That has changed the space considerably. And then there's changes in technology. We cite in the book how civil society movements in Senegal and elsewhere have made a difference in cementing democratic process on the continent. A lot of that, although not all of it, is rooted in the changes we've seen in information and communications technologies, which are now almost as deep in Africa today than they were in the rest of the world some years ago. And in the rest of the world some years ago, they were pretty rooted anyway.
Right. Wonderful, wonderful. Do you see opportunities for either countries in Africa or the international community to further strengthen this trend of better governance so that we essentially mitigate the chances of backsliding?
Yes, I mean, there has to be, and one hopes there will be. I come back to the point I made some minutes ago that how the mineral revenues, when mineral prices were truly buoyant, they've sagged a bit of late, how all of that revenue is used and whether that diversifies the economy is going to be an important way to see if in fact the right institutions are being built. So there's some of that. The other dimension to your question would have to be how the continent and the rest of the world deals with the remaining failed states and problem areas on the continent, because the spin-offs, the negative spin-offs from what's going on even today in the DRC, Darfur, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire is, I think, behind us. But the remaining ones need attention, and if there's backsliding there could still be wider backsliding.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Medhora. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cigionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. I wonder if we might turn our attention to the Canada-Africa relationship. Several of the essays in the book suggest that traditionally there hasn't been a coherent strategy toward Africa within Canadian foreign policy. They also suggest that there are lots of potential new opportunities for engagement in the future. So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on kind of the historical state of the Canada-Africa relationship, and then speculate on how this might change in the future.
You know, I have to say on coherence that when you bring together 24 political scientists and economists, it would be foolhardy for editors like Teddy and I to expect consensus.
Right.
And this is one of those areas in which there wasn't, as in many others, but in which I know that my view is really just my view and not that of the folks associated with the book as a whole. But to be sure, there hasn't been coherence in Canada's relations with Africa. That seems to bother academics more than I think it should, and bothers policy folks much less. Why? Africa is 54 countries.
Right.
I can't imagine what coherence in your relationship with 54 countries would look like. So I think we need to get over this one. Also, you look at Canada's relations with any other region in the world or any other large country, what do we mean by coherence? I think the nature of the real world is that one has to be flexible, one has to be opportunistic, and that we're not writing a graduate essay here.
Right.
That said, I do take the point, and on this I do agree with my fellow authors, that Africa has not been high on the Canadian foreign policy agenda. Now, that's not the same as saying there hasn't been coherence, but I completely take the point that Africa has not been a factor. The history of the relationship, and we have a couple of very good essays on that, actually goes back to pre-independence times. And I think Canada's role during and immediately after the wave of independence in the 50s and 60s was one truly of nation building, institution building, farsightedness. It was a role that was replayed in the 1980s in South Africa.
Right.
And I think Canada has much to be proud of in all of that. It is also fair to say that in Canadian foreign policy, Africa has mostly figured either as an aid issue or a conflict issue, and that we have not seen enough the other dimensions, or not relaxed enough to see the other dimensions of Africa's emergence, which we talked about. We do make the point that Africa is an opportunity for several Canadian initiatives in the private sector, and not just mining, but ITs and energy come readily to mind, and in fact infrastructure more broadly, on which there's much room in Africa to do more. The African demographic is one in which, as Paul Martin notes in his foreword to the book, is one in which there will be more young people than almost as a proportion, almost anywhere else, other region in the world. That's surely a good thing, so long as we're creating the opportunities for them. And for now, it looks as if it's a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. So there's an opportunity for Canada to engage on the education and the employment creation side as well. Canada has a partner in South Africa in the G20.
Right.
Canada has engaged with other African countries on international issues. And so one of the promising things that we see and that we hope is underlined going ahead is that Canada's relations with Africa become more broad-based and are not focused, and indeed they're not anymore, just because Canada's own aid and other priorities have changed and other players have emerged on Africa. But it looks as if that spectrum is going to widen, and that is only a good thing.
Right. How are, generalizing again, how is Canada perceived in Africa? And take South Africa, for example, where even to this day, people like Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark are seen as real champions of the anti-apartheid movement. There was a sense that Canada cared about Africa. Is that still the case? And again, generalizing, it is a big place.
That's right. So we're generalizing, and this is one person speaking.
Right.
My sense would be that Canada, to the extent that it is on someone's radar screen, would be mostly for positive reasons, that the image is a good one. The small but effective builder and investor would be my take. Now there are, as we know in the mining side, some truly bad news stories which have to be dealt with. But broadly speaking, Canadian investments, economic and social and political on the continent, have a good feel around them. I think both CEDA and IDRC have been integral to that image of Canada as a very sound and sensible funder. And as you pointed out in your remarks, Canadian governments have historically been, when they've turned their attention to Africa, have been inclined to do so in ways that are well perceived. That said, candidly, I don't believe that there is an overpouring of awareness about Canada. I think Canada is seen as a decent donor and a decent partner, but the buzz in Africa now is around energy. It's around the emergence of South Africa and Nigeria and others on the continent. It would be, of course, around the emergence of China and to a lesser extent Brazil and India as investors in and players on the continent. Parts of the continent, I think the Gulf states, both UAE and Qatar, are seen to be niche but still important players. And so if you look at that changing global landscape, relatively speaking, Canada's role is declining.
Right. Thank you very much. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Medhora. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. I thought we might build on your last point for our final segment of the episode, and to talk about the growing presence of non-traditional donors in Africa, specifically countries like China, Brazil, and India, who day by day are playing a growing role on the continent. And I wonder if you might talk about what effect they are having on Africa, both positive and negative.
Okay, so with or without your permission, I'm going
Sure.
to widen your question
Sure.
and start with another small group of non-traditional donors, except they've been around a long time, but I do want to talk a bit about the foundations.
Sure.
And the fact that the Rockefeller Foundation, of course, and the Ford Foundation have been on the continent for decades. And the Gates Foundation is now a major player. And I did want to emphasize that in areas like health and agriculture in particular, many of the developments are driven, if not financially, but certainly in terms of the ideas and the quality of the investment, by the work of these philanthropists. And then you've got, as I say, Canada, IDRC, and others as part of that mix.
Right.
But I don't consider them traditional donors either. Now, to your question. It's a mixed bag, China, India, Brazil, and really China is the dominant among the three. The best estimate we have, and by the way, part of the problem here is that we don't have good figures, is that in the last decade, China has invested, however you define it, about $75 billion in total. So we're talking $7.5 billion on the continent. This is a mix of what might pass as ODA, using the OECD's definition of foreign aid, and investments in energy, mainly infrastructure, not the softer sides of development, and that's been noted. So what's been noted? One is that these countries, Brazil and India too, are not traditional aid givers, but that it tends to be a mix of concessional financing, outright non-concessional financing, but actually in sectors that the Africans value, not least because these countries have been through this phase, and so they understand what it is that a country in sub-Saharan Africa at this stage of development might need.
Right.
And frankly, it often isn't what the Western aid agencies, with all of their consultations and all of their log frames, bring on the continent. So I think China, India, and Brazil have got that, and they've been investing in ways that are sometimes controversial, but on balance, I think can only be a good thing for the continent. There's a lot of angst around, in particular, the Chinese investment. And I think the most recent wave of literature, and we do have an essay in the book on this, seems to suggest that that angst is, a lot of it is misplaced, that the motive for Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian investment on the continent, and indeed aid on the continent, cannot be necessarily questioned as being any worse or better than
Right.
that of other investors. That the business about this not being growth conducive or playing into corruption and cronyism is not borne out by the empirical studies that exist to date. And on balance, I'd say that what this stream has created is competition and has broadened the horizons for African countries. Remittances and inward investment into Africa now outpaces, as in every other part of the world, foreign aid flows by a factor of 5 or 10, actually, perhaps even more than 10. And so the terms on which it is negotiated is going to be the next big challenge. I think for now, there's room for hope and caution, but I don't think the sky is caving in, that somehow all this investment is all bad and not going to do any good. But the way in which African countries and African governments frame their relations with this new, not so new, dominance on the continent is going to be an important test of the other point you asked about some minutes ago, which is what is the quality of governance going to look like and
Right.
where is it headed?
Right. Related to this is a growing trend of greater South-South cooperation. And one of the points that Mr. Paul Martin makes in his foreword is that there could be a sub-Saharan African common market, for instance, and that greater cooperation among states within Africa. Do you see this as something that could be achieved in the relatively near future? That this kind of state-to-state cooperation and harnessing their collective power is something that we might be able to help facilitate?
Absolutely. He makes the point, and some years ago, in fact, I always found striking as a factoid something that Nancy Birdsall used to say and still does, that the GDP of the entire continent of Africa kind of sums up to about the GDP of Chicago. And so think of the city of Chicago with 54 finance ministries and 54 of everything, right. And you get a sense of what the fractionalism that we're talking about here. Now, since then, both Chicago has changed and Africa has changed, but it's still, you get right. a sense of that dimension. The integration isn't there yet, and there are two dimensions to it. First I'd say, as a broad point, if there's one thing on which something like the African Development Bank could do even more, and it's doing a fair bit, it would be on African integration. Right. It could well be the forerunner to the European coal and steel community and play that role. It's done so imperfectly, but it is ideally suited for it. So there has to be the will, and there's a lot of rhetoric around that, but I think we're also seeing real will. Then there has to be the capacity to build the soft institutions and the regulations and the enabling environment for things like power sharing and grids and all the other things. And then the third side aspect to that integration is the hard infrastructure on which, again, the work needs to be done. But railway lines, highway systems are not there yet. And so you need a combination of the vision, the financing, and then the blueprints, as it were, for that to happen. It needs to happen, and it really is the remaining frontier on the continent.
Thank you very much. This has been just wonderfully fascinating, and I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure our audience has as well. And thank you to our audience for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us on our next issue our episode of Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Again, look for us on cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.